Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're diving into stories of betrayal, the times people were screwed over by someone else, and how they dealt with it. From backstabbing friends to shady co-workers, these tales of deceit and revenge will make you think twice about who you trust. Some are shocking, others are downright satisfying, but all of them are unforgettable. Before we begin, I want to share something personal. I am raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support would mean the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's dive into these jaw-dropping stories of betrayal and retribution. Story 1. This story does have a happy ending, though it was a roller coaster to get there. My sophomore year of college, I made the mistake of moving in with a new friend, someone I didn't know too well. As it turned out, he was completely unhinged, prone to explosive anger over the smallest things. His temper was matched only by his total lack of respect for others. As if that wasn't enough, he met an equally chaotic, codependent woman who somehow managed to out-crazy him. Without even asking, he moved her into the house we were sharing, without paying any extra rent. Their behavior quickly spiraled out of control. They had no regard for boundaries, constantly having sex everywhere in the house, no matter who was around or what was going on. I'd often wake up to the sound of moaning coming from the living room or even the kitchen. I couldn't get a break, and the stress started taking a toll on me. I was having vivid zombie nightmares nearly every night from sheer exhaustion. On top of that, they never cleaned up after themselves, ate my food without asking, and acted like I should be grateful for their occasional weed-smoking generosity. After 2 months of this insanity, the breaking point came. The girlfriend got pregnant. They decided to move back to Kansas, where she was from, but not before she let slip one of her life goals. Do you know how much money I can get from the government for having kids? A lot. The nerve of it. They left, but not without leaving their mark. On their move-out day, I came home to find the house completely trashed. To make matters worse, a bunch of my stuff was missing small but valuable items. Like my new video iPod. This was back in 2008, and those were a big deal. I knew it was them. No thief would leave behind my expensive instruments, but take random personal items. When I confronted them, they denied everything. As if that wasn't enough, I opened the mailbox to find a final electric bill over $300, threatening to cut off my service if it wasn't paid the next day. I'd been giving my roommate cash, rookie mistake, I know, to cover my share of the bill, but it turned out he'd never paid it. I called the electric company, explaining the situation, and they thankfully wiped the slate clean by starting me off with a new account. I didn't owe a cent. About a month later, I got a text from my former roommate. Collections had caught up with him, demanding he pay the outstanding balance. He sent me a string of threatening messages, trying to pin the blame on me, but I ignored him. Let him deal with the mess he created. In the end, I learned some valuable lessons about choosing roommates carefully and handling bills directly. The house was mine again. The crazies were gone, and for the first time in months, I could sleep in peace. Best of all, karma was doing its thing, and my former roommate got exactly what he deserved. Story 2. My mother was very ill after just having been diagnosed with end-stage liver disease. I took her to the hospital because she was confused and kept falling down. A doctor came into her room, looked at her chart, then at her, and laughed. I thought maybe he had good news. Instead, he laughed and said, "Please don't tell me you think she'll make it to September." I didn't know what to do. I was 20, just out of my second year of college. All I could think about was that I'd be turning 21 in September, and my sister would be starting high school. I just said, I guess not. He nodded, still smiling, and said, "Good, because we're dealing in weeks." I went back to college for my third year, but ended up failing almost everything. I was just waiting for my mother to die. She eventually did, but not for over a year and a half after that doctor made his comment. Even now, the memory of it still hurts. Story 3. The Old Man. He walked out on our family when I was 3, leaving my brother and sister behind as well. They were only 2 at the time. Twice a year, like clockwork, he would reappear, not to support us or to care, but just to check if we were still alive. When I was 5, my mother found herself facing an unexpected expense that would completely drain our food budget for the next 2 weeks. Desperate, she called him and explained the situation. He assured her not to worry, told her to pay the expense, and promised to come by that same night with enough money to cover us for the rest of the month. That night, he showed up reeking of alcohol, carrying a single bucket of KFC, mumbled something incoherent, and stumbled right back out the door. That was the kind of help we could expect from him. By the time I was 6, our shoes were literally falling apart, held together with tape. My mother, exasperated, called him again and demanded he step up for once. He agreed to take us shoe shopping. He drove us to a fancy shoe store, showed us rows of beautiful, expensive shoes, and told us we wouldn't be getting any of them. Then he drove us to a thrift store and bought us flip-flops. That was his version of providing for his kids. I got my revenge by becoming everything he wasn't. I dedicated myself to being the opposite of everything he valued. I studied hard, immersed myself in books, and treated people the way I wished he had treated us, with kindness and respect. I apologized when I made mistakes, stayed away from alcohol, and built a life I could be proud of. I met an incredible woman whom I loved deeply and remained faithful to. Together, we have 2 children, and every day, I do my best to be the father I never had. Being happy, being better, and breaking the cycle, those are the best ways I know to get even. Story 4. My co-workers, by far, are the worst. It's a long story, 3 years in the making, but basically, when I was 20 years old, I was hired into a job in an industrial environment, something I was actually recruited out of school for. The problem is, I walked into a department that hadn't seen a woman since the 1980s, and they weren't happy about it, to say the least. They immediately started making my life absolutely miserable the moment I began training with them, that is, if I could even get them to train me. It started with cruel comments about how incompetent women are, then moved to remarks like, "Women in these jobs have something to prove and are complete bitches." They outright refuse to train me in tasks that make my job extremely dangerous. They've criticized me for my competence, torn into me for my inexperience, which they could easily alleviate with training, and generally made every day a nightmare. One incident that still haunts me happened in the parking lot. A co-worker pulled up behind my car, pinning me in while staring me down. It's worth noting this co-worker has a concealed carry permit, brags about killing people in the Marines, and often rants about how he'd just love to shoot up every goddamn faggot, among other horrifying things. I involved HR, and despite this incident being caught on camera, they lied to me about the footage and told me, "You need to reevaluate how you interpret the actions of others." After that, I completely lost trust in HR or my boss. My boss later threatened me with a final write-up, warning me that if anything else happened involving me personally, I'd face consequences, even though my job performance has always been excellent. This is despite the fact that I've pushed for perfect attendance this year, which is rare in this line of work. The saddest part is, I'm still working there with the same religious zealots, middle-class, middle-aged men who've made my life hell from the start. Story 5. In 2002, I went to university in Edinburgh. Initially, I was quite anxious, was a fair distance from my home in northwest England, and I didn't know anyone else going there. But Edinburgh is a beautiful city, and student life turned out to be great. That said, Edinburgh Uni doesn't exactly offer a broad cross-section of Scottish society. The student body seemed to be largely made up of wealthy English kids from Surrey, looking to rough it in the snowy wastelands on Daddy's dime, of course. By the end of my second year, it was time to sort out housing for third year, moving from halls to flats. My course was pretty intense, so I often had to turn down nights out, parties, and other social events. Unsurprisingly, I wasn't at the top of anyone's list for filling their soon-to-be party pads. Instead, I ended up in a flat with 3 other guys. 2 were fine, but the third Joa, wealthy Surrey lad, was an unknown quantity. He quickly turned out to be a nightmare. We were lucky with the flat. It was brand new, 3 floors for 4 people, and incredibly close to the new Parliament. The rent was massively undervalued at £270 per month each for what was apparently a £500,000 property. We signed the lease and went our separate ways for the summer, except for Joe, who stayed behind to enjoy the festival. I left all my coursework, architecture models, and computer in my locked bedroom, thinking it was safe. Big mistake. About a month later, I decided to celebrate my birthday with 2 friends at the festival. Since I was already paying rent, on the train up, I got a call from one of the other flatmates. "I'm moving out," he said. "What? Why?" I asked, now concerned. "It's the flat. Joe's completely trashed it," he replied. This didn't sound good. I told him I'd check it out myself, and not to tell Joe I was coming. When we arrived in Edinburgh, we headed straight to the flat. I planned to sneak in quietly, drop our stuff in my room, and assess the damage. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed something odd about my bedroom door. It was in pieces, half hanging off the hinges. Shit. Inside, my room was unrecognizable. 3 crumpled sleeping bags lay on the floor, and I stepped on a used condom. The blinds were ripped off the wall, and the unsweeter brand new feature was a war zone. There was piss everywhere, and what I could only assume was smeared shit on the shower walls. The shower head dangled like a broken payphone. My wardrobe, trashed. Coursework, crumpled. Architecture models, destroyed. My computer, its side panel was off, and one of my jumpers had been shoved inside, its components smashed. It was carnage. Next stop, Joe. The living room, which was connected to the kitchen, was equally horrific. About 10 sleeping bags and a mattress, we had no furniture yet, were strewn across the floor. In the corner, I spotted Joe, half conscious on the mattress, his head lolling on the floor. But the kitchen, that was the DE. Among spilled baked beans and beer cans lay an assortment of drugs that would make Scarface blush. A large pile of cocaine, remnants of about 50 lines, a bag of ketamine, 5 bags of pills, and 2-ounce bags of weed. There were burnt pieces of foil everywhere, likely from crack or heroin, and in the middle of it all, a used syringe. I went back to Joe and woke him up. His bloodshot eyes opened, and the look on his face was priceless, a mix of shame, fear, and confusion. "What the fuck are you doing in my flat?" he slurred. "Your flat? Are you kidding me?" I shot back. He kept insisting it was his place now, and told me to find somewhere else to stay. After an infuriating back and forth, I realized there was no reasoning with him. I briefly considered finding another flat, but decided that I shouldn't have to. This was my home too. I called the landlords. They met me outside the flat the next day, visibly concerned after hearing my account. As we entered, it was like a scene out of Ratatouille, but instead of rats, it was an endless stream of disheveled French and Spanish people fleeing the flat. Some were half naked, all were completely off their heads. Then, just as things seemed to calm down, the shirtless woohoo guy from earlier bolted past us into the flat only to come running back out seconds later, this time without the woohoo. The landlords swiftly evicted Joe, and that was the end of him. He lost his flat, his friends, and completely derailed his degree. The best moment. A few minutes later, as Joe slunk away with his pashmina-clad girlfriend in tow, he looked back. My friends and I were sitting in my bedroom window, watching the spectacle unfold. we gave him a cheerful wave goodbye. The arse. Story 6. I met my friend Jay in junior high, and by high school, we were best friends. We stayed in touch through college, attended each other's weddings, and remained close. In 1999, Jay left his job to join his brother in a lobby's internet startup. Knowing my skill set, Jay invited me to join him. At the time, I had a stable job with a major defense contractor, but it was the height of the dot-com boom, and I figured I could afford to take a chance. I agreed, but I made it clear that our friendship had to remain intact, no matter what happened at work. So, I became employee number 6 at what is now a $10 million company. On paper, I reported to Jay, but our years of friendship meant our working relationship was casual and unstructured, a dynamic I thought was positive. Turns out, I couldn't have been more wrong. For 11 years, I poured my life into that company. I designed and built the technical infrastructure for our product, put in countless late nights and weekends, and carried a laptop or phone with me everywhere to make sure services were never interrupted. I was on call 24/7 every day of the year for over a decade. Over time, 2 things became painfully clear. B's nepotism and cost-cutting obsession. B always chose unqualified family members over experts for management roles. His belief that expertise could be outsourced to the cheapest bidder led the company into a slow decline. Jay's inability to lead. Jay avoided confrontation at all costs. He couldn't give constructive feedback or address problems, so he just accepted subpar work. His aversion to conflict meant that the company's dysfunctions were never addressed. Around 2006, Jay and B decided to completely rewrite the company's product from scratch. A decision they made without consulting me, the one person qualified to run such a project. Jay chose to outsource the rewrite to a cheap offshore firm and insisted on a rigid waterfall methodology, where no code would be written until all design, documentation, and specs were 100% complete. If you know anything about software development, you know this was a disaster waiting to happen. 2 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars later, not a single line of usable code had been written. The outsourcing firm was fired, and the entire project was scrapped. Undeterred, Jay launched attempt number 2 in 2008. This time, the plan was even worse. Reverse engineer the existing software, rebuild it in Java, and then start improving it. Jay's measure of success: customers shouldn't even notice that the software had changed. It took 5 years, over $500,000, and endless delays to create a slow, buggy replica of what we already had. Throughout the project, I was sidelined. Jay excluded me from key decisions and refused to listen to my concerns. There was no source control, no unit testing, and no automated builds or deployments. Every tiny change required hours of manual effort and resulted in customer downtime. These weren't seen as problems, just business as usual. By 2010, the strain had destroyed my friendship with Jay. He decided to resign after the project's first phase was complete, saying he'd had enough. I thought, finally, my chance to fix everything. There was no one else in the company even remotely qualified for his role. Surely B recognized how badly Jay had mismanaged the project and would see the value in promoting me. But then I unknowingly set myself up for failure. In a casual conversation, I made a comment that Jay wildly misinterpreted as, "If you leave, I'm leaving too." Jay, thinking he was doing me a favor, relayed this to B without so much as a follow-up conversation with me. B began interviewing my replacement. I didn't realize any of this until months later, when a comment from Jay tipped me off. I immediately clarified that I had no intention of leaving. I couldn't afford to quit, didn't have a wealthy spouse to fall back on like Jay did. By the time Jay announced his last day, the damage had been done. B informed me that our department would now report to his completely unqualified brother, aka self-absorbed, clueless manager who had been gunning for my job for years. Furious, I called B to confirm. His response: "Why do you care? You're leaving anyway." That's when I learned I'd essentially been fired months ago, without ever being told. I explained the misunderstanding, but B dismissed me, saying, "You've put me in a pickle." Apparently, he was the victim here. I asked if he even knew that Jay had excluded me from critical decisions for years, because I disagreed with his terrible ideas. He didn't. B had assumed that every failure was on me. A week later, B finally called to let me go, but he couldn't even bring himself to say the words. I had to explicitly ask, "Are you firing me?" He mumbled through some nonsense about transition periods and severance pay. But I agreed to help onboard my replacement because I'm not a vindictive person. 2 weeks later, H falsely accused me of sabotaging the company by giving my replacement incorrect information. B believed him without question and sent me a certified letter threatening legal action. Luckily, I had meticulously documented every interaction: emails, instant messages, phone calls, you name it. The evidence clearly showed that H's incompetence was to blame, not me. After 11 years of sacrifice, I walked away with my career in shambles, a severed friendship, and a deep understanding of how toxic leadership can destroy everything you build. If there's any silver lining, it's that I learned what kind of workplace I never want to be a part of again. Story 7. A few years ago, my so-called friend asked if he could drive my car. At the time, I thought he was a good friend, so I agreed. Big mistake. This genius decides to go 50 miles per hour down a hill, and, thinking he's some kind of speed racer, tries to drift around a corner. Of course, he instantly loses control, spins out, and plows my car straight into a light pole. Totaled, completely wrecked. Right after the crash, this guy has the audacity to turn to me and say, "I've already got 2 strikes on my record. You should switch seats with me and say you were driving." Seriously, I shut that down immediately because, 1, I only had a learner's permit at the time, and 2, I wasn't about to take the blame for his stupidity. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, he starts spinning this huge sob story. He tells me and my parents that his family is broke. His parents just got kicked out of their house, and they're struggling to make ends meet. My parents, who were genuinely good people, felt bad for him. Meanwhile, we were down to just 1 car and had to struggle for 3 months to make it work. A few weeks later, I ended up hanging out with him again, and we went back to his house. Except, it wasn't some rundown shack like he made it sound. No, this was a full-blown mansion. Gigantic pool in the back, lavish decor, the works. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This guy had completely lied about his family being poor, just so he wouldn't have to face the consequences of wrecking my car. To make it worse, not long after the whole ordeal, he gets a brand new car. Meanwhile, my parents and I are still scraping by with 1 vehicle because of what he did. The nerve of this guy. But karma came for him. A while later, he tried pulling some ridiculous stunt at his college straight up, stealing computers like he was in some amateur heist movie. He got caught, kicked out of school, and his life took a nosedive from there. Honestly, knowing that justice was served makes me feel a little better. Story 8. Back in middle school, a friend and I got into some kind of argument. To this day, I can't even remember what it was about, but at the time, I decided I wasn't in the mood to deal with her. So, for an entire weekend, I ignored all her calls. My family happened to take a trip out of town that weekend, and since we didn't have a cell phone or even an answering machine, this was back in the day, she had no way to reach me. Honestly, I figured I'd just cool off and we'd move past it. Now, here's where things go off the rails. This was about a month after the Columbine tragedy, so tensions everywhere were high. To get my attention, or maybe out of sheer spite, she decided to call the school and report that I had supposedly told her I was stockpiling guns and bombs and planned to show up on Monday to kill everyone. I had no idea she'd done this. When Monday morning came around, I arrived at school to find the place swarmed with police. The scene was absolute chaos, and neither I nor my parents had been warned about any of it because, again, no cell phone or answering machine. I was completely blindsided and scared out of my mind. It wasn't until later that I found out what she'd done. Needless to say, I never spoke to her again. Years later, I ran into her while she was working as a clerk at Target. She was even heavier than I remembered and still had terrible acne. I won't lie, saying that was pure Story 9. I had this friend in junior high and high school. We'll call him John. For the 6 or so years I knew him, we were pretty close. John would come over almost every day after school, and we'd spend hours playing StarCraft. It was a regular thing, and we got along great. After graduation, though, life took us in different directions. I went off to college, and John joined the military. He got stationed in South Korea, but would visit every now and then. Things seemed fine at first, but after a couple of years, he started to lose his grip on reality. He finally had a full mental breakdown after his first ever date went poorly. The situation got so bad that he was committed to a mental institution. That's when the phone calls started. He somehow got my cell number and began calling me every day. Every single conversation was the same. He'd demand that I tell him something good about himself or explain how his life was better than mine. Normally, I'd be too much of a pushover to stop him, but at the time, I was already stressed trying to juggle college and my relationship. It all came to a head one morning when I was supposed to have breakfast with my girlfriend's family, and John wouldn't leave me alone for over 2 hours. That was when I really started questioning the friendship. The final straw came when John decided to move back to Texas to go to school. His family had relocated to the Northwest while he was overseas, so he couldn't qualify for in-state tuition in Texas. To get around this, he forged documents claiming that he lived with my parents. I didn't know about it until one day my dad called me, saying some officials had shown up at their house asking about this guy supposedly living there. My dad had to spend a lot of time clearing up the mess, and even now, we're not entirely sure everything was resolved. When the school found out about the forgery, John was expelled, and then he had the audacity to blame me for ruining his life. That was it for me. The friendship had spiraled so far out of control that I couldn't take it anymore. I cut all ties and haven't spoken to him since. Story 10. I dated a girl for 4 years, my first love. It was great. Then I went abroad for 2 years, on terms we both agreed on and fully supported. We stayed in contact the whole time, exchanging letters and calls, and I came home expecting to basically pick up where we left off. Even get married someday, based on everything we had talked about. But when I got back, she dropped a bombshell. She was dating someone else. Just casually forgot to mention that. It crushed me. I had to accept it and move on. Eventually, I met someone new, an incredible girl who helped me heal. Fast forward, and on my birthday, the original girl shows up, unannounced, on my doorstep. She tells me she's questioning her engagement to the guy she left me for, and asks me if she should go through with it. It was like being hit by a truck all over again. She broke off her engagement and tried to get me back, but I stood by my new girlfriend, who later became my wife. Now, I have 2 amazing kids, a loving marriage, and a life I wouldn't trade for anything. That first relationship broke my heart in ways I never fully realized at the time. It changed me. It was a dark, painful period, and even though life worked out for the better on both sides, the scars are still there 8 years later. I'm not sure if I've ever really forgiven her. Maybe I haven't, or maybe I don't want to. I've always just tried to deal with it and force myself to move on. Writing this out now, though, it feels kind of therapeutic. Story 11. Not me directly, but my grandmother screwed over my father so badly that it impacted our entire family's future. She's a truly evil woman. My dad had been dating a Spanish girl from the Bronx for over 3 years. He loved her and was planning to marry her. At the same time, he had dropped out of college to focus on his pizzeria, which was doing incredibly well. It was even rated Long Island's best pizza at one point, and he had dreams of turning it into a franchise. Think Papa John's was on that kind of trajectory. But my grandmother, she's an old-school, deeply traditional Sicilian woman, and she couldn't stand the idea of my dad marrying someone who wasn't Italian, let alone a Spanish girl from the Bronx. She completely refused to accept the relationship. She took it upon herself to meddle in the worst ways possible. She told my dad's girlfriend directly that she was no longer welcome in her house and harassed her constantly, to the point where the poor girl couldn't take it anymore and ended the relationship. My dad was heartbroken, but my grandmother didn't stop there. She arranged a marriage for him with her best friend's daughter in Italy, completely forced. To this day, I wonder how different life would have been if my dad had been able to marry the woman he truly loved. Now, on to the pizzeria. Dad was making great money and had big plans, but out of nowhere, his credit card debt exploded into the tens of thousands. When he called the credit card company to figure out what had happened, he found out that his own mother had used his credit card to buy plane tickets to Italy for the entire family, racking up that massive debt. She promised to pay him back, but never did. Because of this, my dad had to shut down the pizzeria. To this day, I believe he could have built something as big as Papa John's if that hadn't happened. And as if that wasn't enough, the wedding money for his arranged marriage mysteriously disappeared. There's no official word on where it went, but everyone in the family has a pretty good guess. My grandmother's actions didn't just wreck my dad's dreams, they shaped all of our lives in ways I'll always resent. Story 12. After 5 years, my ex left me. We had been living together for 4 of those years, and during that time, I did everything I could to support her. I helped her try to build credit, even though she'd never paid the credit card bill. I bought food, paid for her phone, and handled countless other expenses. I thought we were building a life together. One evening, I had just finished washing dishes and was getting ready to cook dinner. It was a bittersweet moment, been grieving the loss of my cousin, who I was very close to, and that day was the first time I felt like I was starting to emerge from the funk. I finally felt like I was contributing again and moving forward. Then she walked in. She said, "We need to talk." And just like that, she was gone in under an hour. A month later, after not seeing her during that time, I agreed to meet her for dinner, hoping we could reconcile. That's when she dropped another bombshell. She hadn't just left me, she had left me for a good friend of mine. Someone I had let stay at my house multiple times. Someone I had gone out of my way to help. It was devastating. I may try to be friends with her in the future, but honestly, after how she left me without helping with anything, leaving me several $1,000s in the hole, I just don't see how I could. She isn't the person I thought I loved. As for him, I will never forgive him. There's no greater betrayal of the bro code than what he did. Story 13. I'm still trying to decide if I can forgive my parents for this one, but here's what happened. Going into my senior year of high school, my parents assured me they would cover the cost of college. With that in mind, I chose a really expensive school, just shy of $50,000 a year. They still said it was fine, so I went ahead. Fast forward 1 year. They sat me down and told me I'd have to cover 1 year of my college expenses. Okay, I thought. That's not ideal, but $50,000 in loans is huge. Then, 6 months after graduation, they hit me with the real news. I was on the hook for the entire thing. All 4 years, that's around $140,000, even after financial aid in my junior and senior years. The kicker: they waited until after I'd spent $5,000 on a motorcycle to tell me. It was a dumb financial decision on my part, but at the time, I thought I didn't have much debt to worry about. If they'd been upfront with me from the start, I would have chosen a much less expensive school. Now I'm stuck living with them to save money, but everything they do grates on my nerves. My original plan was to go to grad school, but that's off the table because their private loans can't be deferred for graduate studies. I've been thinking about just moving out, saying, screw it, and burning some bridges with a few choice words. At this point though, I'm still weighing whether it's worth it. Story 14. This one boyfriend. I thought I was smarter, stronger, and wiser than this, but I got sucked in by a sociopath. He was my friend and neighbor's brother-in-law. He'd just been released from prison after serving 4.5 years for armed robbery, his second strike. They introduced us, and before I knew it, he moved in and just wouldn't leave. At first, it seemed okay. He seemed genuinely interested in learning basic life skills and reintegrating into society. I'd been in a similar place when I got sober, learning how to balance a checkbook, build credit, and live a stable life. I figured I was paying it forward. I co-signed for Sears and Chevron credit cards, thinking I was helping him out. Eventually, I cut up the Sears card, but I later learned that only a signature was required to use the account. He ran up $2,500 on the Sears card and another $750 on Chevron grocery shopping at a gas station. Seriously. After about 5.5 months, his behavior turned verbally abusive. He had already shown signs of being controlling and tried to isolate me from my friends. Before it escalated further, I kicked him out. But that wasn't the end. He stalked me from my neighbor's place. We shared a balcony and would show up at all hours, leaning on my doorbell with excuses, like needing to retrieve something from the garage. Given his violent history, I took it seriously. I moved, got a P.O. box, learned to shoot, and bought a gun. I contacted his parole officer, who wasn't interested until the guy missed an appointment. Eventually, I met with the officer and provided evidence that he had been living at my place, which was a parole violation. That's when I learned he'd started using meth again for the first time since his release. I obtained a stay-away order through the parole department. Side note, the parole officer hit on me during our meeting. Not long after, the local police contacted me. They were looking for him in connection with a burglary. I gave them everything I had on him. I also sued him in small claims courts and won, though serving him was a nightmare. By sheer luck, his uncle accidentally called me, and I learned he was in custody. I had him served at the jail. The police kept me updated over the years on his antics. Somehow, he avoided a third strike because of plea deals that kept conviction rates high, according to a contact I had at the department. Then, a few years later, I walked into work to find the local newspaper in the break room. On the front page, above the fold, was his face. He'd been shot and killed by police after a meth-fueled high-speed chase in a stolen car. It was the most surreal moment of my life. I can't say I felt sad, maybe just relieved. Story 15. High school sweetheart. This story is a bit long, but even 22 years later, the details are etched into my memory. They really set the scene. Our relationship was a hurricane in a bottle for several years. We'd be all hot and heavy, then get into stupid arguments, fight, break up, make up a week later with earth-shattering sex, and repeat the cycle. Her home life was a mess, so my mum had her move in with us. We had separate bedrooms, but that didn't stop anything. My mum figured it out. Eventually, she wasn't happy about it, but she let it slide. I joined the military with plans to make it a career. I asked her to marry me and told her that, as soon as I got stationed, we'd pick out rings and set a date. Life felt like it was coming together. Then, a week before I graduated from 8, my mum died. A massive heart attack took her just after she'd woken my girlfriend up for school. She had made herself a cup of coffee, sat down to watch Good Morning America, her daily routine, and that was it. I was wrecked. My mum and I were incredibly close. She was my only parent. She had kicked my dad out before I was born, so it was just her, me, and my siblings. Losing her shattered me. I went home on bereavement leave and got to the house late that night. I crawled into bed with my girlfriend, sobbing and emotionally broken. She tried to comfort me, and somehow we ended up having desperate, grief-fueled sex. It wasn't about passionate, it was just raw and human. I fell asleep holding her, trying to steady myself. The next morning, my sister came to the door to wake us up. She said we needed to go to the funeral home to handle all the arrangements, things like choosing the casket, her clothes, and other details. I told her I'd grab a quick shower and be ready. After my sister left, my girlfriend freaked out. "What's your family going to think of me?" "They're going to think I'm a slut," she said, panicking. I tried to reassure her. They'll assume we're sleeping together, they won't care. You lived here, you're basically family. It's fine." She calmed down, and I went with my siblings to handle the funeral arrangements. The day was surreal and heavy. When I got back home, everyone treated her like one of us. She helped around the house, and my siblings' wives made sure she felt included. That night, we had sex again, one of those moments of trying to feel alive despite the crushing weight of grief. The next day was the funeral. I got up early to finalize some paperwork at the funeral home and came back around mid-morning. When I pulled up to the house, I saw her standing on the curb with a suitcase. Her dad's car was pulling up. She looked at me and said, "I can't handle this. Your family is going to think I'm a slut. You're too sad, and this is all too much. It's better if we break up." Before I could respond, she jumped into her dad's car and was gone. She left me on the day I was burying my mother. If I'd been 5 minutes later, I wouldn't have even seen her go. She'd left it to my sister to tell me she was breaking things off. The revenge. 5 years later, I was out of the military and living a bohemian life. Out of nowhere, a mutual friend gave her my number. She called and got my roommate, who knew exactly who she was. He told me, "Don't call her back. She'll suck you back in, just like she always did." But I had to know. I called her. She picked me up and made me dinner. That night, we had sex just as wild and passionate as it had always been. I stayed the night, and in the morning, she brought me breakfast in bed. We had sex again. She started talking about us getting back together, planning a wedding, and even asking when I'd move in. I played along, nodding and letting her talk, enjoying the moment. When she dropped me off at home, I walked in, closed the door, and never spoke to her again. She called and left endless messages until my roommate finally got fed up and told her, "Oh, he's off with his new girlfriend." Got in, got off, got out. And that wraps up tonight's dive into the times people got screwed over and the wild ways they handled it. If these stories shocked you or even gave you a bit of satisfaction, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more gripping and unforgettable tales. Hit the like button, follow for updates, and check out my other videos for even more incredible stories. And one last thing, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your generosity truly makes a difference. Thank you for watching, and remember, trust is hard to build, but so easy to break. Stay safe, stay wise, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.